Rocket technology has improved significantly over the years, from some early small suborbital rockets, to moon rockets, to literal space tourism spaceplanes. To work out how we got from this to this, we need to go back and look at a brief history of rockets. We start our journey in the year 1926, when an American engineer and inventor, Robert Hutchings Goddard, invented the first liquid-fueled rocket. Little did he know at the time that his technology would be what lands humans on the moon in 43 years. To summarize how it works, it is essentially a single-stage rocket with one engine, fueled by liquid oxygen and gasoline. This bottom part here contains the gasoline tank and the liquid oxygen pressure line. Both the gasoline and the liquid oxygen travel up separate lines that go to the top to the igniter, where they are mixed and burned together and fire through the engine as one fuel. It also has a support structure to help it stay upright before launch. On launch, the vessel separates from this support structure and continues upward. While this rocket only achieved a maximum altitude of 12.5 meters above the surface, it proved the basic rocket concepts that we still use today. Now we can fast forward a bit till 1937, during World War II, in which Germany developed the V2 rocket. The V2 was an incredibly powerful weapon, capable of devastating entire cities. But this rocket was also the first rocket to breach the Kármán line and enter space. The Kármán line is essentially the agreed border between the atmosphere and space. This sits at about 100 kilometers above the Earth. The V2 rocket is a single-stage rocket that contains 4 stabilizer fins, 1 engine, and a warhead on top, along with being fueled by alcohol and liquid oxygen that are mixed and burnt together and then fire out the engine. This rocket also took the first image of our beautiful blue planet from space. Traveling 20 years into the future to 1957, we get to the first orbital satellite, Sputnik. Launched by the Soviet space program, Sputnik was the first artificial satellite to enter an Earth orbit. That essentially means it's in space and traveling so fast horizontally that as the Earth tries to pull it down, it can't, and the satellite instead circles around the Earth. Sputnik 1 was launched on an R-7 rocket, which was developed by the Soviet space program. The R-7 rocket, which was also known as the first intercontinental ballistic missile, was a very powerful machine. Unlike the V2, the R-7 utilized 4 radially attached boosters to climb to space. The boosters would then detach and break off from the central core, which would continue to orbit. The R-7 utilized 2 stages. The first stage had high-thrust engines used to break it out of the atmosphere, and the second stage was vacuum-optimized and had more efficiency but lower thrust. The Sputnik probe itself was held inside the payload fairing up the top. This would essentially protect the probe from aerodynamic forces and in turn make the rocket more efficient. This would break off soon after it enters space. The first animal was actually also launched in a Sputnik probe. The dog Laika was the first animal to enter space. Not only this, but the R-7 rocket was the rocket that took the first human into space and into orbit. Yuri Gagarin. Sputnik wasn't just an artificial satellite, but also the start of the so-called space race between the US and the Soviet Union, a heavy competition between 2 nations to achieve certain milestones in space. Just a year later in 1958, NASA started Project Mercury, America's first human spaceflight program. Project Mercury as a whole had 3 objectives it wanted to achieve. The first was to orbit an American around the Earth, have both a spacecraft and a human recovered safely back on Earth, and also test how the human body functions in the environment of space. All 3 of these objectives were achieved by 3 of the rockets built for Project Mercury. The first rocket built was Little Joe. It was essentially a small test rocket comprising of a single solid rocket booster. It was used to test the launch escape system, which, in the event of an emergency, would pull the capsule away from the spacecraft and down back towards the Earth safely. This system was crucial for the safety of the astronauts on board, and has been used in about every single rocket since. After the launch escape system was proven to work in an emergency, NASA began working on the Redstone. The Mercury Redstone was a suborbital rocket, meaning it could get to space but not to orbit. This was a single-stage rocket that could take humans to space and back down to Earth safely. While some of the initial test flights without humans on board weren't exactly successful, the Mercury Redstone still performed 6 successful suborbital flight missions with humans on board. The only flaw to the Mercury Redstone was that it couldn't reach a stable orbit as it simply didn't have the fuel. Clearly another design was needed to get to orbit. Soon after the Mercury Redstone, the Mercury Atlas was designed. The Mercury Atlas was by far the biggest rocket of the program, being built up by a large central core along with 2 boosters attached to the side. This extremely complex machine could not only reach space, but also reach a stable low Earth orbit and return humans safely to the Earth. For the amount of stages this rocket has, it gets complicated. It is often described that it has 1.5 stages. Let me explain. I'm simulating this here using Spaceflight Simulator. As you can see, if I detach this, the boosters fall away. However, the main engine is still attached to the rocket. So, if part of the first stage is still there, does it really make it a stage separation? This is why it's sort of agreed as a half-stage separation, and that's why it is mostly labelled a 1.5 stage rocket. Once the Atlas actually reaches orbit, the capsule will detach from the main core. Once it has done a few orbits, it will fire its retropack. The retropack is a set of solid rocket boosters meant to deorbit the craft, essentially meaning slowing the craft down so the Earth's gravity can pull it down back into the atmosphere. The Mercury Atlas also sent the first American into a low Earth orbit, John Glenn, and safely returned him to the Earth. Project Mercury as a whole lasted from 1958 to 1963. 2 years later, in the year 1965, Project Gemini began. The main rocket of Project Gemini was the Titan II, a 2-stage orbital rocket that was capable of reaching orbit and taking humans safely back down to Earth. The Gemini capsule itself was a large upgrade from that of Project Mercury. Project Gemini's capsule could fit 2 astronauts instead of 1, had more life support systems and could last the crew for longer, and even had a docking mechanism to dock to other spacecraft. This was one of Project Gemini's main objectives, to test how exactly to dock and rendezvous with other spacecraft in orbit and learn more about how it can be done. The Gemini capsule itself utilized RCS thrusters, or reaction control systems. They're essentially tiny thrusters to maneuver and turn in the vacuum of space. This is how the Gemini spacecraft was able to do complex maneuvers in the vacuum of space. It was essentially a spacecraft that could fly in space. In order to dock in orbit of the Earth, you need to match your velocity with the spacecraft you are targeting. Then you need to do precise maneuvers to move closer and closer to your target. Project Gemini's goal was essentially to test many of the mission aspects of the Apollo missions, such as having crew in space for a long time and docking with other spacecraft, crucial for the Apollo missions to the moon. Project Gemini as a whole lasted from 1965 to 1966. And now we move on to 1968, where we had the first crewed flight of Project Apollo. What most people don't know is Project Apollo actually started back in 1961, where it used craft such as the Saturn I, Saturn 1B, and Little Joe 2 to test various equipment of the Apollo missions coming up. And after John F. Kennedy's famous moon speech back in 1962, NASA and the United States as a whole was determined to beat the Soviets to the moon. The first crewed mission of the Apollo program, Apollo 7, was designed to test the command module and service module, and test that all of the equipment on board would function well. Apollo 8 was the first mission to orbit the moon and safely return to Earth. Apollo 10 was a practice of the landing sequence without actually landing. And Apollo 11 touched humans down on the surface of the moon for the first time. Apollo 13 had a major malfunction where an oxygen tank exploded in the service module. Due to the astronauts' quick and clever thinking, they managed to survive the journey back to Earth. Apollo 15 was the first Apollo mission to send a rover to the moon, and Apollo 17 was the last time to this day where astronauts touched down on the moon. The launch vehicle for all these missions was the Saturn V. This 3-stage rocket, which was 111 meters tall, was the world's most powerful rocket up until the recent days of the SLS and Starship. Project Apollo as a whole lasted from 1961 to 1972. After this, NASA began developing the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle would launch like a rocket and land like a plane. It was the first partially reusable rocket. The Space Shuttle was mainly used to do things like deploy certain spacecraft and also carry astronauts to the International Space Station. The Space Shuttle Discovery also deployed the Hubble Space Telescope, which has taken some truly incredible images of our universe. The Space Shuttle was also the rocket that launched many of the modules of the International Space Station. The Space Shuttle flew from 1981 to 2012. After the Space Shuttle retired, however, America as a whole didn't have an orbital launch vehicle to launch their astronauts to the International Space Station. So they used the Russian Soyuz rocket. Even though this rocket was built in the 1960s, it still flies to this day. But the US still didn't have their own orbital rocket that could transport crew to the International Space Station. That was until the year 2020, when the private space company SpaceX developed the Crew Dragon capsule and the Falcon 9 rocket, an incredible two-stage rocket with a reusable first stage. The CEO, Elon Musk, has also developed many other interesting rockets over the years, such as the Falcon Heavy, an incredibly powerful orbital rocket that can transport heavy payloads into space, and the Starship, which is the world's most powerful rocket and will eventually transport humans to Mars. Not only this, but now NASA has developed the SLS, which will be the main rocket they use in their Artemis program. The Artemis program is set to land humans back on the moon. It has already launched Artemis 1 in November of 2022, which sent a human-rated spacecraft around the moon and back for the first time in 50 years. Now, Artemis 2 is set to launch in 2024 and will launch a crew around the moon and back. And that brings us to where we are today, 2023, where we now have rockets that can land themselves, go to Mars, go to the moon, and also transport crew to orbit. Safe to say, we've come a long way, and we will continue to advance in our space technology. But as we expand into space as a species, it's important that we look back and see just how far we've come.